Thank you very much. So he asked me to basically put an entire semester course in about 50 minutes. So I did not put all of my slides into one PowerPoint. So what I did, and I think you sent out a survey to the group, maybe kind of what's some like the key areas, some of the big fish to fry, the big topics to address. So I pulled out some information that I don't teach it anymore, but we have a course, AgCom 810 called Scientific Communications. It's really targeted more towards how you as researchers communicate your science to other scientists within that, hence the scientific portion of the name. If it were just science communication, then that's more oriented of you as researchers communicating science to non-science type audiences. When I used to teach the class, we did have kind of a section at the end of the course that was a little bit more on science comm. So how do you take it out to less technical, more what we kind of call a lay audience or a general consumer? I use that phrase loosely. So, but what I pulled today is just some kind of key thoughts and concepts I think that will hopefully help you out a little bit. Grab all of my props. So based on the survey feedback, whoops. I think I just need to click back on. Let's see if this works. There we go. Now we're in. All right. So based on your end, I'll stay over here because the camera. So your interest, what I heard, was looking at some things related to flow of writing. So the continuity of thought from beginning of your papers to end of your papers and how to help kind of almost from a scientific storytelling perspective. And within that, then an idea of clarity of ideas. There was this one, these two were fleshed out a little bit more. And then these other three, this idea of strength of citations, I want to kind of pick apart that. I've got a couple of different approaches relative to what strength of citations can be and can mean. Looking at depth of sections, how rich, how detailed do you go into sections relative to papers? And then there was a kind of a general category relative to formatting with respect to journals and reference citations and some of those things. And so, so what I put together is really kind of in two broader areas, this idea of clarity and flow, kind of your message, your story, your content of the paper, and then a little bit more on kind of procedural pieces relative to structure and getting it ready to actually go into journal. Less about your science and how you're communicating it, but more about application and relevancy to journal. So I'm going to jump in. When we think about a scientific paper, there's a concept, sort of a general format, but it can vary by journal depending on where you're going with it. But it's this concept called IMRAD, or the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. It's kind of a lowercase a in there. That I guess otherwise it'd be the IMRAD, and sounds kind of weird. So IMRAD, throw that a in there. But really what it is you've got this section of introductory material, your methods, et cetera. And those sections come together to constitute your paper. But really, when we think about it, these sections are about your topics, your thoughts, your ideas. They have relevance and purpose. There's meaning to why we have those different sections and the role that they fulfill within the paper. And I'll talk a little bit about those. I won't go real in depth on the meaning behind those sections. But the whole idea is that it's kind of a synergistic approach in that the whole of the paper hopefully will be greater than the sum of the sections. So when somebody's finished reading your paper, and you're all grad students, I know that you've probably not read papers from cover to cover, beginning to end. There's a whole approach. Yeah, you hit the title, kind of skim the abstract, maybe pull it open, look at the figures, tables, into the introductory section to see what their objectives or goals or hypotheses were, jump to the end of what did they find, conclusions, and then maybe go back and discern it a little bit. So it's not really cover to cover kind of reading sort of thing, not always anyway. Or you may go through it 3 different times, but you're going through it looking at it for different functions, like, oh, it was about this topic. What did they learn? Oh, that's great. That helps me do some context. And it's like, oh, I'm doing something that's kind of relevant or related to that. Let's go and see how they set up their study. What design did they use? What was their statistical analyses? What kind of plots, seeds, reagents, whatever, assays, all those kinds of things. What did they actually do in that? So the different sections have different meanings at different points of how you're consuming that paper, that research. So our goal, and hopefully I can give you some insight today a little bit, in that we're going to progress, we're going to hopefully move from a gathering of sections into hopefully having one comprehensive paper that gives them some rich understanding of the science that you're doing. Or actually, I guess at this point, it would be the science that you've done. If you're publishing it, hopefully you're done with it, or at least that part. Otherwise, we got a whole bunch of ethical issues coming out that we have a whole chapter in the book to talk about, but that's not for today. So our sections together, making the paper hopefully is going to be a lot different than just this smattering of sections. So I mentioned the MRAD format. We can break this down a little bit more. When we think about, these are some more, I call them a little bit more of like subsections relative to then maybe like chapters and whatnot. Different journals use different titles or different descriptors for some of these. Sometimes they may just call them methods or your methodology. The introduction type content and the literature review type content sometimes are put together in one section. Depending, sometimes the discussion and the results are kind of put together. Sometimes like, here's the data, and then there's a whole nother section that's like, here's what the data mean. Sometimes all of this stuff down here is lumped together into one ending section. But they're still, from their roles and their functions, still exist in some part and parcel within the paper. So just a quick kind of how I situate my mindset. Introductory is basically setting up what's the problem, what's the current state of affairs, what's happening that is necessitating you to do research. There's a gap, there's a hole, there's an issue, there's a problem. Literature review then is the, well, here's what's been done in this area in the past to try to also address this, or here's what's been done that thus has resulted in now there's this new gap. We didn't know all of this stuff in the past. They've done X and Y. So now that really highlights the fact that we don't understand Z. So we need to study Z to have a complete picture, whatnot. Materials and methods, in my opinion, is probably the easiest section to write. It's a cookbook, it's a recipe, right? Here's what I did, here's what I used, here's how I use those things, here's how many times I use them and where I use them, all that stuff. It's just very descriptive. Hopefully you've kept solid notes in your lab journals or whatever. So you know, like, oh yeah, I did use that versus this and things. So that's pretty straightforward. The results piece is the data. It's here's, by doing this with these, this is what we got. We ended up with 7 dozen burnt cookies. All right, that's it. The discussion then puts meaning to the data. So these have your R values, your betas, your whatever tests you're running, et cetera. The discussion then says, we have an R of this or a beta of that or a whatever. Is that good? Is it bad? Did it work? Did it not work? That's what the discussion. So this, everything from here down, especially the further, this section here a little bit, that's the hard part, because that's where you as the scientist have to come into play. Your faculty may think, but may not actually verbalize this, but up until this point here in all of your work, they don't care what you think. And that sounds really bad. Because up until this point, it's a series of justified decisions. Everything you're doing up to that point, you're making decisions based on evidence of some sort. What else has been done in the literature, where the problem is, what the trade press is saying that there's insect issues or nutrient uptake issues or whatever. All the way up to that point, you're making decisions, but it's all based on other stuff. this point here is now, or if you're doing your thesis or dissertation, especially in the traditional format, chapter 5, that's the part where we care about what you think. You're the scientist. Now you have to take the numbers, the whatever your results are, and now you have to start putting meaning to those based on what you said you were going to be doing at the end of your introductory. So either your objectives, your research questions, your hypotheses, or however you're kind of structuring your study from that guiding principle. Did it work? Did it not? Conclusions. So what did you learn from, if an R of 97 is really good, then the conclusion was what? Then this worked, it didn't work, you should have done something different. And sometimes, depending on your philosophy or your discipline or your journal, this kind of implications piece may take a couple of approaches, or probably two parts. One is, what are the implications of your research for the discipline, agronomy as a whole, or plant breeding, or soil science, or whatever? But then, are there other implications of that for the practice? So when we think of implications for the discipline, that could be, what did you learn relative to what the literature, previous literature had said was your stuff in concert with what other work had said, or is yours actually differing from what you were kind of expecting based on what was in the literature, et cetera? The implications can also be relative to the methodology and methods approaches. Like, yeah, we tried something different and it didn't work, but we tried it for these reasons and it made good sense, but it didn't work in this case. And here's why we think. Or we did it the way everyone else did. We didn't get the same reasons or the same type of results that we were expecting. And maybe here's why. So as a result of that, we did it in dry land, not irrigated. Big difference. So therefore, in the future, we change our methods for dry land in these ways. So you can have implications for the research, but then depending on the type of work you're doing, there also may be kind of an applications element. So what's the implications for crop production, for nutrition management, for crop scouting, all those pieces? So kind of thinking about how your work helps the discipline and move the body of knowledge forward, or contribute to the body of knowledge, but also contribute to the practice component of the science, the area that you're working in. So when we look at all these, I like to think kind of your paper and your scope of discussion sort of in this kind of hourglass approach, in that when we look at the stuff at the top, the introductory piece, the literature review, et cetera, we're looking a little broader perspective. What is happening in the discipline? What's happening in the field? What's happening in the other research and related fields of study? Genetics and physics and chemistries and things relative to whatever you're studying. And it doesn't have to necessarily be fully encompassing. One of the scope questions, or my thoughts on scope, in your dissertation or your thesis, things like your literature review, depending on your chair or major professor's philosophy, it might be more of an all-encompassing, like, we got to look at the holistic body of knowledge and kind of its ebb and flow over history and time and how it's developed to where it is. In a paper, it's more about what's the relevant pieces to the study that you're doing. The more current stuff, you don't have to talk about the whole backstory of how you got to where it is. It's more about where's the state of things right now relative to what your work is at this point. Then when we get to these pieces here, these kind of three sections or pieces or parts of your paper, they're more introspective. It's really just focused on what's happening in your study, your science, your research that you're producing, your methods, your results, your discussion about those results. But then as we start to get down into the conclusions, implications, now we're starting to go extrospective, not intro. We're starting to look outward again. We're starting to connect back out to other pieces of literature. We're starting to look out to the discipline, other disciplines, et cetera. So how is your work and the results and the meaning of those results of your study then connecting back out to other pieces? So kind of two visual aids I like. This is one, kind of this hourglass thing of as we come down. But the one that I think is even more critical is this, in that in your paper, you start with your introduction, your introductory type materials. You're going through your materials, that MRAD, the results, kind of this whole discussion's kind of flaring back out. But the part I often criticize in the papers that I review, and I'm sure agronomists are probably much better at this than the fields that I review papers. Oftentimes this little leg here is missing. It's not a leg. This little link here is missing, in that what from your study, what are your conclusions, your implications? How do those tie back? And I point here at the bottom because usually it's kind of that ladder of your introductory type where you have your goals, objectives, purpose of your study, et cetera. Tell me, so what? Answer those questions. Go back to your hypotheses. Go back to your questions or objectives. Our objective was to find out X. Awesome. Did you find out X or did X not work? That's when I used to teach this class, my phrase in there was, cliffhangers are amazing for TV movies or TV shows. They're horrible in scientific literature. I don't want to have to wait and read your next paper to see how this one ended. Okay. Give me that spoiler here in this paper. Tell me how this study ended. Did it end well? Did it not? Did you answer your questions? Did you find that your null hypothesis, you didn't support that, and therefore you had to accept your alternative hypothesis, all those things. I've read several papers that the introductions, like, oh man, that is a huge problem. And yes, in the literature, there's a huge gap. No one's working in this area. It's, hello, why hasn't anybody done this work? And you're doing it from this really novel, amazing way that no one's thought about it yet. It's like, and then I get over here and it's like, yeah, those are some really cool results. And then it just kind of stops there. It's like, okay, but did that answer your question? Did it tie back? So put a bow on it, close the loop. That's a big thing as you're reading through your papers to think about, how did this paper address what we said we were going to do? Did we solve the mystery or not? If we didn't, then what's the next episode going to look like? What's the next approach? That's that. Kind of the adage is, research basically creates more questions than it does answers. Well, we at least need to tell the answers that we've come up with in this research, and then where does it go from there? What's that next steps? What's the next pieces and parts that come from that? Because kind of in my opinion, without this piece here, you're really not giving this full picture and providing that full understanding of the science that you did. That's that critical piece from you as the researcher, is helping whomever's reading this or whoever's like spot reading it, jumping through it, help them understand, all right, this is what we set out to do. And yeah, we accomplished that. We found out that 1, 2, and 4 work, 3, 5, and 9. Yeah, not so much. Here's why, and here's what we suggest you do differently next time, because 3, 5, and 9 are really important to this area of study. Okay, so just kind of think about that process as you're going through these. When we think about then, if those are the pieces, that's the process of your paper, how do you maintain that flow? And one thing that I see a lot of times that can really benefit, but is often not included in papers, is this idea of transitions. So when you're writing your paper and those section heads that go in there, those are not walls. It's not like you read up and you stop and then, you pick up and you start again. Your writing and I've got this, if I move to my next slide. This idea of transitions is they are basically word alerts that go in your writing that give the reader a clue that, all right, there's a change that's coming up here. There's going to be a change in thought. There's going to be a change in idea. There's going to be a change in perspective, whatever. So understanding how some of those transition words like therefore, or obviously, or in conclusion, or, and I've got this, it's not a link, but I'll give you time. This writing center from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has a really good, it's a blog post, basically. It's a really good one that talks about these 3 kinds of transitions. So there's transitions within a paragraph. And obvious, not obvious, a A good example of that would be something maybe in your literature review, when you're synthesizing a particular area of research that says, you know, this idea works and this idea is built from this, and there's a commonality of the research that says this. However, there has been some work that contradicts or that doesn't uphold within those conditions. That however word is that transition is like, oh, wait, there's something coming up that's not going to agree with this previous idea. So that would be an example of an in paragraph. The idea between paragraph transitions is that where it really comes into play is that our writing should be this idea of what they call paragraph-based writing, in that each paragraph within your paper should contain only one major idea. You can compare and contrast elements of that idea, like, you know, all the research says that apples are awesome, except Smith. Smith said that apples are not awesome for this reason. You know, that's still relative to the awesomeness of apples. So it's kind of that one idea within the paragraph. But then you don't want to continue that paragraph to say, oranges, though, they're the really sweetest thing. Oranges are a whole nother topic and they're sweet. So that's not awesome. You're talking about sweetness and you're changing fruits from apples to oranges. Therefore, you need a new paragraph. We kind of get that already from our writing perspective, but it can be easy like, oh, let's just kind of lump a lot of things together. But what that helps us do then is towards the end of a paragraph, as we're shifting, we can put a sentence or so at the end of this that, hey, we're shifting ideas. We're moving away from apples and awesomeness, and we're going to also then talk about oranges and sweetness. It helps move the reader from one thing to the next. They don't have to jump the gap from one paragraph. You're building the bridge that they can mentally walk across that mental bridge from one idea into the next idea. And then the last type of transition that they have in this writing center is this idea between sections. And that's kind of the, wrapping up the state of affairs. And now we're going to talk about how we go about conducting this research, or based on those methodological approaches, now here's the data that we collected using those techniques. Maybe not quite that obvious, but it's that idea. It's not, oh, methods, here's what we did, done. Here's what we found, done. Here's what it means, done. But it's, we did this, and as a result, now we realize that this is the data that came by doing those approaches, those methods. And what those data then really mean will be discussed in depth, and then you can go into that discussion. So it's, you're leading them along with those little word cues of these transitionary pieces. It's also kind of like at the end of sections, you could also use kind of the literary approach of like foreshadowing. Like, I'm gonna maybe kind of give you a hint here of what's to come in the next section. Which then gives them an idea of what to look forward to when they get moved and transitioned into that next piece of writing. But yeah, this writing center, this tips and tools on transitions, they have some examples in there of there's 4 different types of transition words that they refer to. And I don't remember all 4 of them. One is an emphasis, one is a comparison, one's I think a contrast, and I can't remember what the 4th, that might be wrong on those last 2. But they give you some examples of those kind of transition type words so that if you're doing that sort of thing, and also they give some examples of, you know, as you're going through the middle of your paper, you may be using some of those comparison and other type words. If you're concluding a section, then you may want to look at some of those emphasis type transition words, because like they're kind of a summation, like you're putting emphasis back on like key points for that section. And then that helps you then build into, so you're putting a bow on that whole section. You've talked about these different points in the paragraphs. Here's sort of this concluding thing using these emphasis transitions, which then means you're going to move into the next section of whatever that means. But this is a key process to kind of think about as you're getting into the writing of, your goal as the reader is to help lead them through your study from one to the next. Not just expecting they're going to jump. They'll jump, because if they're reading your journal articles, they're probably sort of familiar with science and your topic, et cetera. But from a clarity, a transitions, a flow of thought process, the comprehension piece really then comes, and the understanding, we go back to this, comes from helping lead them from here all the way around instead of having them leapfrog from section to section. So transitions, I pulled out a couple of key areas from a clarity piece, but then also I didn't make copies because I wasn't sure. And so I brought an example. We can pass this around if you want to look at it, but I provided a digital copy, a PDF for this that I don't know if you can send it out, but I suggest to send it out to the meeting, but you can look at it now. It's got a whole lot more than just this, but I pulled out a couple of pieces that I see. From a clarity standpoint, scientific writing is very bad at, that's not bad, it's a heavy user of passive voice. Oftentimes that happens because we're trying to keep the researcher out of it. So we're trying to write this sort of third person objective, standing back and looking and describing the research. So instead of, we found, we often say it was found that. And so it can be a little more, it can detract from the comprehension and understanding through a lot of passive voice. Two is it adds a lot of words into the writing when you're doing passive voice. So a couple of short examples. Active voice, the dog chased the cat. Passive voice, the cat was chased by the dog. And there's good descriptors in this, if I remember right. I think it's this one. I have a lot of handouts from this class that talk about writing forward versus writing backwards. That's kind of what this whole idea between active and passive, or these two examples of writing forward versus writing backwards, is kind of what these two examples are as well. The other one, concise word usage, in that your journal article does not or should not be your effort of trying to be the next Shakespeare and be very literary and flowy, and how many different thesaurus terms can I use for the same thing. It does kind of get repetitive and redundant, but it's like, okay, so you lost me here. So some examples of that would be, this was accounted for by the fact that, this happened because of that. Just lay it out there. Clean up some of the extra words, or prior to, prior to adding the reagent to the tube, duck your head because it will explode. Before you pour the stuff in, duck, it's going to explode. Those kinds of things that just really helps kind of tighten that up, fewer words, allows you to put more stuff in. If you got a page and word count, you don't have to do that fudging of margins and fonts, like 11.9 and those kinds of things. Funny thing, when you transition from undergrad teaching to grad teaching, undergrads will go like 12.2. Like, oh, it's not quite long enough. Grad students will go like 11.8. It's like, oh, it's almost it's a little too long. Big difference between undergrads versus grad. Or in the event that, if. Now, this will happen if that happens. This will happen in the event that happens. Yeah. There's a bunch of those examples. They also have another reference in here too, to an entire, a whole nother list of many, many more of these ways that we try to be flowery and sound very technical and scientific and throw all the, almost kind of like on the borderline of like legal speak of like, wherewith then and the therefore outs and that's kind of that Shakespeare stuff. Yeah, they got just be clear, straightforward, forward writing, and this confusing words handout. That's what I'm talking about here. That and there's a lot more in there than just confusing words. They talk about some things like relative of which versus that. So one of the functions in our department, we have the Research and Extension Communication Services unit. One of our editors, she used to talk about going on a witch hunt. As she was editing, she would look for the WHICHs, take those out. Usually you take those out and you put in a that. And then if you've got a that, then usually you can just eliminate the that's and just write it straight through. So there's some good kind of tips in there. There won't be a test on this. I can set it up. I saw Ignacio in the hallway. He'd be all for that kind of stuff. You didn't know him. So now thinking about kind of shifting gears, that was a little bit broad strokes of some philosophy on writing and content and flow, and from a clarity of helping lead them through and having your writing in a way that you're just declaring. It's very declarative writing, declarative and descriptive. This is what happened. This is what I think. This is why I think it, that sort of thing. Not, well, we kind of maybe possible, just say it like it is and put it out there. So we think a little bit more about structure and formatting. I talk about citations and depth a little bit coming in here. So when we think about citations, this is one too that is for graduate students. You learn this, I think, especially going from master's into doctoral. And as you're really starting out, who's master's, who's doctoral? Who's the master students? Okay, which semester?
First year still.
First year. Okay. So the first time you had to write, like, hey, go write me a lit review. I don't know what yours look like. I know when I was assigned to do that in graduate school 20 some years ago, my lit review at that point basically was an annotated bibliography. It started out, Jones and Smith said this, Michaels and Houston said that. Like this paragraph was one paper, next paragraph was another paper, next paragraph was another paper. And that's okay, but the value that you'll, I'm guessing you've probably grown into this a little bit because you're shaking your head like, yep, that kind of sounds familiar. The rest of you, maybe you've blocked that out of your mind from way back when you started in grad school. But your idea here is to really synthesize the content of the papers. So what did they find in the papers? What was their conclusions? Did it work? Did it not? Did it increase by 10%, decrease by 5%, those kinds of things? It's much less generally important who said it and who did it when you're talking concepts and lit reviews. So very much put who said it in the parenthetical references. And not that you should do this in the end, but go through and you can like try deleting the parenthetical references, and then you can just read the thought process through rather than the niche.com said that Kansas State College of Ag is number 7 amongst colleges and universities. At this point, maybe it's important that you know, especially if you're doing that contradictory thing, like Kansas State College of Ag is number 7 amongst colleges ranked in 3 different reports. However, niche.com says they were number 19. So when there's like an outlier kind of thing or a contradictory thought or whatnot, then that might be where it's kind of important to say, well, this person, this study, this lab, whatever, they did something that was kind of contradictory to the general flow or the general consensus of the ideas within the literature. You know, this one shouldn't start out USA Today, US News and World Report, Time, Today, Wall Street Journal, and Sports Illustrated all rates Kansas State College of Agriculture number 7. No. K-State was ranked number 7 in 19 different studies or whatnot. And then you can reference all those studies or that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's one thought from the citations piece of, we talk about this, the strength of citations. I didn't know, kind of, that was one thought process of, in general, take the emphasis off of who said it and what was it that they said, and then use those pieces coming out of their papers. That's what you're using to build your arguments. That's what you're using to explain the gaps. Talk about the progression of the history of that type of study or that type of science or whatnot. And then, if, like I said, if there's certain instances where there was maybe something different, something unique, there was a whole different line of inquiry that got started at a certain kind of point in time, then maybe it's a, niche.com changed the approach to which they were using chemical assays and reagent tests and lab work, blah, blah, blah. Because there was that big shift and they were the ones that made the shift. And so then maybe that's a little important that you're highlighting the fact that they did that. Then we think about though the types, the citations citation types and the strengths of the different elements that you're actually citing in the works. This is probably a little bit more open from where you're open, a little bit more relative to what your discipline views and sees. A lot of the common ones are the journals, maybe there's some books. Books seem to maybe come in a little bit more maybe from a methodological approach where they've studied, where they publish some methodological approaches and, particular chemical assays and those kinds of things. Sometimes I get questions, can we use like popular and trade press as citations? So soybean digests or something along those lines. I typically tell my students that you can, if it's in the introductory area, to maybe set the context of like the state of industry or the state of a problem that's being seen. So if there's something that's in a trade magazine that's relative to, the 2021 soybean crop was decimated because of an onslaught of cyst nematodes or something along those lines. Well, that article within it probably also cites some USDA reports and some things, but you're trying to look at, okay, here's kind of the state of what's happening in industry. And so you could maybe use those sparingly to help paint a picture of this is a problem. Last year alone, you could also then maybe if the data is out there, pull in some USDA yield data or yield crop reports or something like that to also help justify that. A lot of other different types of things, proceedings, those pieces, they're in general, your elements that have some form of a peer review. So your papers, the things that you try to push up on your CV as well, build those up on your CV, especially those you doctoral students looking to go out, academia jobs, et cetera. Your journal articles, your conference papers and published proceedings or published abstracts, if they're in that peer reviewed category, they're probably not too bad to use in those references. We talked a little bit, books, especially if they're edited books, because that's also an additional form of a kind of a peer review process that's gone out there as well. Not formal peer review from a blind review perspective, but at least there's another person kind of reviewing and validating that content.
Doctor,
Yes, sure.
can we ask questions?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
You prefer, we can wait until the end.
Either one.
All right.
I have enough content to go till 6:30, but.
All right.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. 2 more slides, but yeah, no, feel free to ask.
It's because it's very, it fits very well to this
Sure.
topic that we are talking about. And I actually saw a Twitter recently, and then it just blew my mind because it actually happened to me before, but I'm gonna read for you the tweet and maybe you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. But basically the guy said, I feel embarrassed, like I should know this, and I also do. But if I read article A that cites article B, and I want to cite what article B says, do I cite A or B? And I'm asking that because on my mind, I would originally think, oh, I should go read B and cite B because article B is the article that actually found what I want to cite. But then what happened once, I was reading article A and then I found exactly citation from article B that I needed. I went ahead, read article B, and then the person that was reviewing my article knew that I got the citation from article A, but it was referred to article B. And then the person kind of like added article A on the citation too. But to me, I just felt that was like, not wrong, I don't know, like what's the word, because I'm like, article A actually did not find this, article A just mentioned site B on the introduction, but there was not like a result or a discussion that was found by article A,
Yeah.
So like on my mind, I always had like, I need to cite whatever the article found, like whatever the research found, not.
Yeah.
Because I can cite a lot of people in my introduction and then people was like cite the same paper and me, they're going to have to cite my paper, like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
So
I don't know what your
I
thoughts.
have 2 thoughts on that.
All right.
One, my argument with students or my emphasis with students is that you should minimize or so that like citing B in A, I call those secondary citations. It's like your paper C, right? So in your paper C, you're citing what B said in A. That's getting kind of confused, all letters here.
We're following.
So my argument is that you should always go back and find that original paper, read that original paper and cite that original paper. Because for a couple of one primary reason, you don't know if paper A or author of paper A really interpreted or understood paper B correctly and how they referenced it in their paper. You're kind of just taking them for their word that they understood it and interpreted it, et cetera. And so therefore you should definitely go to get paper B and read it and cite directly that original source. If for some reason you can't find that original source, like it was a 1934 study or something and that library burned down and they can't find the paper anymore, so you can't get to it. Then you can do this secondary reference that in your paper, you can say, according to author B, as cited in author A's paper. So therefore you're attributing it back to that first paper. So you're citing the first paper, but you're clarifying that you're citing that first paper as it was referenced in that second paper. So you're not just blindly, that's also called a blind citation. If you never read paper B and you're just citing it based on what paper A said, then that's a blind citation and that can get you in trouble.
Yeah. So that's the thing. So I read B, but then this person went there and put A because I was just using A as a reference, because it was a very similar topic. So I was like, all right, let me see what paper A cited so I can
So A was in 2020 and they referenced B that was in, I don't know, 2012.
Yes. And then
You cited the 2012 B.
To 2012, because then I used.
But then the reviewer in their comments, whatever.
The 2020.
Put the 2020 paper. Yeah.
But it was like similar topics, but was not like the founds by the paper A.
Yeah.
And I was like, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I know the person knew that I was using paper A as a reference to get the citations because it was a very similar topic. But I don't know, just.
So as you're then revising that paper and resubmitting it, you don't have to do everything the reviewers say you have to say that you should do in your revisions. But when you submit that revised paper, I don't know how your journals and things do this, but typically we submit a letter saying let's get out of the A's and B's. Reviewer one's comment was this. We did implement that. Thank you. That helped clarify the point and elaborate it a bit or whatever. Reviewer one said this. We did not make that change because how that citation is being used there is a double citation. So we went to the original source
Exactly.
found in paper B of 2012.
Okay.
And don't feel that it was appropriate to just cite the 2020 version paper A.
Yeah.
And you can put that explanation there. And then they can have a philosophical debate of how you should do that. And you can work that out with the editor and that kind of stuff too.
I mean, if they had similar results, it wouldn't hurt cite both.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They did a study in 2012 and found this, and then they did something sort of comparable with these adjustments in 2020 and they had comparable results. So yeah, I'm going to cite the 12 with this and then the continuation of the work modified in 2020 with comparable types of outcomes. Yeah. That would be a point if I was your chair or lead author. If you're lead author and I'm also on it and a faculty member, I would argue that no, don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't follow that recommendation of just citing A because they cited B.
Yeah.
Cite the original.
Yeah.
And the only time then, in my opinion, that you would bring the two together is if you couldn't find the original B.
Yeah.
And you couldn't find the 1812 version. So now you've got the 1912 that cited it. Say per 1812 as cited in 1912.
I got you.
This is the outcome. So they know that you didn't actually go find the original. You're basing yours off of hopefully that the 1912 interpreted the 1812 properly is how they described it in their paper. Because in writings that I've done that, I have found papers where Jones in 20 talked about Smith in 12, and I go back to Smith in 12 and I'm like, how did they get that? There's did I not get the right Smith? They're talking about chickens here, and this paper's all about ducks. Or, worse, this is all about pineapples, and they're talking about chickens, and I don't, apparently we're not on the same thing here. So, yeah, so that's really careful about doing the blind reference to the original and not ever reading it. Yeah, no, great question. That comes up. And also I was reviewing a paper, it was 3 weeks ago or so. And my argument to that one is they had too many of those secondary references. It was, Smith as cited in Jones, Smith is cited in Jones, Smith is, but they had like 4 or 5, like Smith is in Jones, Jones is in Reagan, Reagan is in Kopp, whatever. It's like, no, stop that. Go find the original. What it was I think I didn't confirm based on the citation and go find it. But what I think was there was either like a lit review paper or there was a book or something that then had all these other references in it. So they just used all those references out of that lit review or out of that book instead of going and finding the whole list of papers that were cited in the book. They just cited the book or cited them per the book. It's like, no, because you don't know if that, again, that editor may or may not, the author of the book may or may not have interpreted the papers, represented it properly, got the right paper, whatever. Yeah, no, great question. And if people argue with you on that, you can send them to me and I'll.
All right.
Happy to help you fight battles where you need to. So when we think about the depth component, we've got these sections here, and by depth and richness of content, I kind of already talked about this little bit of like, intro and lit review and things. You don't have to be all comprehensive of like, well, in, I don't know, 1813, Findelay started this, and then it evolved into this, and then there was some penicillin found somewhere in there, and you don't need to give all that history. But when we think about richness and had the volume of, if this is our 100% paper here from beginning to end, this is purely a rule of thumb. This is like no absolutes by any means. And these can shift kind of depending on your paper, but also if you're thinking more about like conference presentations and that kind of stuff, I would argue, especially in a conference presentation, this is probably a maximum in that, if they give you like 10 minutes plus 5 minutes of questions, and then usually when the flag goes up and they've maybe hit it to this mark, have you been in those conference presentations before? Like time and like, oh, let me fly through to the end and not show you any of my data. And we'll just tell you, here's what we found. While they're like trying to shoo me off the stage because I've gone over my time already. Yeah, that's like, no. In your paper, these are important because, it sets the stage, gives the background, gives them the clarity. Some have asked me, okay, well, how depth and detailed do I need to go with my research methods? A kind of a rule of thumb is that your methods should be clear enough and detailed enough that a competent scientist should be able to replicate your studies. Somebody in your field that knows what they're doing should be able to either follow your methods and then also go to your references, et cetera, and then probably be able to understand and replicate your study based on it. So you don't need to put everything from the methods books and explain the whole assay based on how it's written up in the, I don't know, the ACC or whatever guides and those kinds of things. But your reference to it, and if they're a competent scientist, then they can follow your references, they can go get that method to run the assay or whatever, and then they can be able to do it. Your paper doesn't need to be replicatable by like the common lay scientist or somebody out of philosophy or by Joe consumer walking down the street. It doesn't need to be that kind of detail, but the competent scientist could follow your paper, use your references, be able to go out and fairly closely replicate your study from a materials, methods, details. So they need to have that depth. but then this is the heart of your paper. So, and you could probably argue, is it 60-40, maybe it's 50-50. You don't want to skim too much on the beginning because then they don't really necessarily know what you're doing. Again, unless it's like that time constraint of like a conference presentation where they just need to know enough about this is what we set out to do and this is roughly what we did to do it. And then boom, here's what we found. And even then at a conference piece, you probably diminish the implications piece a little bit. Really, here's what the data were, here's what they meant, and here's what we took from it. And then kind of okay, so then going forward, this is what we're viewing as the next step. That could probably be like 2 sentences at the end, sort of thing, in that kind of presentation. Same thing if you're doing like a conference poster. That the goal of the poster is not to put an entire paper on that 4 foot by 4 foot area. It's basically taking the abstract and putting the abstract on that 4 foot by 4 foot area. So from a clarity of understanding and communication perspective, on posters, I'd argue less is more, because it's just like hitting the high points, the key elements, not, oh, here's 12-point font of my entire paper and I just stuck the papers all so you don't have to flip them because now I have space to lay them all out 4 foot by 4 foot. No, that's not the approach from a poster's perspective. So this is, like I said, this is a really rough rule of thumb in terms of thinking about, okay, so how much do I need to put into this? Some may have differing opinions. Like I said, a great place to get a better understanding of this though is this right here. And thinking of, so we think about formatting, there was a question like, so how do we best format this for the journal? I can't tell you because it all depends on which journal you're going into. So those journals have guidelines. Get those guidelines, print them off if they're printable in some format. I know it's like, oh, we're supposed to do it all digital. No, highlight the suckers, write notes, have examples, those kinds of things. Because they may change their citation formats. Some may change how they want the data tables formatted, and we use mean versus the italic M versus the Greek mu, all those variations for that. So read and understand their guidelines. And another great thing is look at other works that are published in those journals. You're probably already doing that, you're reading it. But again, I said, remember at the beginning, I said, you're going to go through those papers probably multiple times for different reasons. This is a great reason to go back through some of those papers. How did they use similar data analysis techniques or tests or whatnot? How did they present the results for that statistical analysis or whatever you ran? How did they present the design of a split plot randomized tests? How they describe it, how they discuss it? Is there a commonality through the papers of those kinds of methodologies of how they describe certain things? How much detail did they go in? What's acceptable or expected in that journal? Those kinds of things. So that's the guidelines, and then looking at those other works. And then also, so you already do this because you're grad students, but the more you read those papers, the more you'll pick up on what makes good writing and good papers, and what makes for really hard papers to understand, to follow, to comprehend, to get. And you'll probably start to see maybe some trends of authorship or labs or whatnot. They're like, oh, it's another one of those Ellis papers. The guy can't write his way out of a wet paper sack. So don't read that one. Just skim it if you have to. Hit the highlights. Don't read it. Those kinds of things that you'll start to pick up on those. And ask your major professors too, like, hey, what are some good journals? What are some good papers? What are some that you've seen out there that just make sense? I don't think I have references to them. It might be in this book. But anyway, there's a couple of like these really rich, deep, like Einstein written papers, but the way they're they're in a little bit different format because this kind of MRAD structure didn't really come about as much until after or during the Industrial Revolution, where there was just this advent of science and technology and publication. And so they kind of formalized it just because of the volume of work that was coming out. Really old school science publication was a narrative journey. It was kind of this, well, we started out, we had this thought and this idea, and we went through and I did these things. It's like, yeah, that's great. Get to the point. that was good when there weren't as many journals, as much science coming out, but then kind of that industrial revolution era and technology, research, advents of science and chemistry, et cetera, really just started to roll. And the publishing world, journal world changed just from a volume. All right, so how do we get this study out, this research out in a succinct and comprehensible and comprehensive manner so that people can get it? And that's kind of where that MRAD design came out of, like, nope, here's the problem. Here's what's been done in the past. Here's what we did. Here's what we found. Here's what it meant. Here's where that contributes and why that's important. Move on to the next study kind of approach. There's a philosophy that I talk to my students about. It's a little bit more relevant to grant proposals, but it can also kind of come into play when you think about putting your journal article together. It's kind of like the idea of three little pigs. You know, the story of three pigs. There's the one big bad wolf is coming along. Three pigs. First one built it with what? Straw. Yep, straw. What was the second pig he built his out of, or she? Sticks. And then the third one, brick. What happened to the first one? Yep. Puff, puff, blow it down. Second one, puff, puff, blow it down. Third one, puff, puff, nothing happened. Your research, your introductory section, describing the wolf. Big eyes, big ears, big teeth, to hear you, see you, eat you, all that sort of stuff, Granny. I'm here to huff, puff, blow your house down. Methodology, or the literature review, pig 1 and pig 2. Here's what's been done before. They didn't work. A little bit about maybe here's why they didn't work. Pig 3 is then your objectives or your questions of your study. Well, here's what we're proposing. We're rolling in with bricks and we're going to build the house with bricks because based on wheat and wood, those are straw and wood, those don't work. Bricks are a lot more durable, been tested, et cetera. Our hypothesis is it's going to withstand. All right, so here's what we did. We put the pigs in one house, invited the wolf, that kind of thing. Did it work? Did it not? All right, so what's that mean? We should probably build our houses out of bricks if we have a wolf problem. We got a tornado problem? I don't know if bricks are going to be the thing. We got a flooding problem? I don't know. Maybe wood's better. It'll float. Yeah. Those kinds of conversations. So think about it from that perspective a little bit of, you're going to be writing your papers like, oh, Ellis and those pigs. All right.
Like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that, yeah. Ellis 22, three little pigs theory of writing. All right. Other questions, comments, concerns? Oh, before I get that. I've got a variety of different books. This one's one that I've used in class. There's a much better one out that I didn't actually use. I was a reviewer for some of the chapters of a different book that came out, but I really love that book. And I loaned it and I couldn't find it. It's not on my shelf. So I can get you the citation for that other one as well. But this one's a pretty good one too. I've used this one. The problem with this one, problem with all of them is that they try to help all scientists. And so they're a little bit more from a general perspective. So you're like, okay, so how does this relate to my field? But the other book that I have is still pretty kind of general from that perspective, but it's about as thick, but I think they use about half weight paper. So it's got a lot more content in it. And I'll get that one and try to find it and send it to you as well. But if you want to take a gander at that or picture of it for citations or whatnot, to go pull it off. I have a couple, actually I have 2 7th editions. I have 2 or 3 6th editions on my shelf. So if you're, and I've got a bunch of others too from, one is more out of the science or not science. Yeah. Broad science. I think I've got one that's more kind of like biology type oriented. So I've got kind of sort of some that are more oriented towards sub-disciplines of not just science. Kind of a big area. So now I'll stop. Questions, thoughts?
Well, I've got another question.
What we're here for.
So from that part that you're talking about, I guess like the transitions. From the beginning, I would say, I guess my question is, sometimes what I personally struggle with is I have a lot of to say, and then my paragraph gets too long, but I don't find like a good break, you know, to maybe split that paragraph into, I'm like, okay, if I split here, but no, but I need this sentence here, but okay, I can't split here, but now I'm gonna have a very short paragraph next one. So I don't know, like, do you have any tips, I guess, for this kind of situation?
Not without like seeing the paragraph.
Yeah.
And I'm happy if you have struggles, challenges, you're like, how do we get this thought out? Or I've got like a page-long paragraph, but it's all kind of related. I'd be happy to sit down and visit with you about, okay, so what are some editing approaches? Where could we maybe slice it? Or there are elements we could move and transition between the points? But part of that maybe is to going back to kind of foundational paragraph writing, and that your initial sentence is like, kind of, here's the thesis of the paragraph, here's the point, and then here's some supporting paragraph sentences behind that. But then if like, and maybe first look at this idea, this site on these transitions, because those 4 types of transition words or categories of transition words, those might give you some ideas of, as you're looking at that, like, okay, so all this is kind of related, but if I use a transition, then maybe I can actually sort of split these kind of sub areas of like the befores and the afters, or the lefts and the rights, and then be able to have them into smaller sections, smaller paragraphs, and flow from A into A1 sort of thought process. But yeah, I think maybe starting with some of these breakup words, and how can you use those to kind of split? You know, is it comparison and contrast? Is there, of all of that, so are you kind of giving a general lay of the land, and then there's a particular element you want to emphasize? All right, well, then you can use a transitional piece of, this paragraph is more of this kind of broader synthesis kind of thing, and then you transition into, but let's specifically focus on this element that comes out of that broader concept. Some different ideas, and share your paper around. Have someone else, you're like, I got a lot of stuff in this paragraph. Can you help me figure out how to split it, or rewrite it, or reorganize it, or something too? Makes sense to me, but I know what it's supposed to say. It's also another thing. This paper, I think, talks about this handouts. Proofreading and editing are not the same thing. Have people that you know of that are good at both. Proofreading is like, oh, is there an extra space? Did I put 2 periods here? Are all my citations formatted the same? Did I use the same font type for my subheads? You know, are there any misspellings that then put profanity in your paper? You know, those kinds of things. And always remember, assess has 2 S's at the end. Okay. Just remember that. I don't know how many different undergrad PowerPoints I've seen in class presentations, where they talk about assessing something and they're not really assessing it based on the way they spell it. So that's a proofreading thing. Editing is what you're talking about. All right, so how's my thought? How's my flow? Is it choppy? Does one item lead into the next and into the next, or does it go from like 1 to 2 back to 1.2 and then down to 3, and then I'm coming into 2? You know, that's the editing, is, you know, structure, flow, wording, rewording, that sort of thing. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
To me, I think the hardest transition to make is between some of our major sections, because going from the introduction, lit review into materials and methods, you got your hypothesis and objectives that does a pretty good job of transitioning. You can transition from, say, a discussion into a conclusion, but generally in the papers I read, we end the methods with our statistical analysis and results. There we are.
Yeah. So you gave a couple places, the transition between like the end of your intro into your methods, right? Because like, okay, here's our objectives, or here's our hypotheses, and then here's what we're going to do. Maybe there's a sentence in there like, you know, data relevant to testing these hypotheses were collected using a random split plot trial on, you know, across 42 different locations, whatever. And then that can go into the method section saying, you know, this study involved these locations using this, or, it can at least give a little, that's that kind of foreshadowing sort of thing. And maybe it's just one little sense of like, okay, so these hypotheses were going to be addressed through this approach. And then it's boom methods, and then you kind of go into that approach. Or what was your other one? Coming out of your statistical techniques that you used at the end of your methodology, and then goes into your data section. These analyses yielded results that included such and such, and then that bumps you then down into a little bit of starting into your, because I'm presuming maybe then as you're looking at your data section, you kind of hit a little kind of broader strokes of data, and then you start getting into like kind of the specific details of either the test for this replication or the test for that location or the whatever. So by having that little kind of introductory short paragraph, or like a couple sentences at the beginning of your results, or your results / data, that gives you that chance of being able to flow out of those analyses into, as a result of, applying whatever analyses to the data, or applying these analyses to the data of the study. Here's kind of what we found. So it didn't have to be like real big and real long, but it's at least kind of a, okay, so we found this and we have these hypotheses. They're going to guide this kind of they're going to be used or realized in this kind of a study design. And then you can go into your methodological in more detail in that kind of thing. Almost like maybe taking that like first, not literally, but kind of like the first sentence or two of kind of how you open the section, and sort of bumping it above the subhead of like, you're kind of foreshadowing of going into that next section, that kind of idea, just to give them a springboard into the next section. And it's not to say that the sections really have to be that completely flowy. Probably more dissertations and theses is more where that like flowing from one section into the next makes a little bit more sense. So at least within your sections, does it kind of logically flow and lead from one piece to the next within that section? Especially on paper where you're limited to what, 12, 14, 18, 36 pages with or without figures and tables and whatever. Yeah. Thank you. So then that transition may not be as critical, but at least thinking from that thought process of how am I writing this to lead from here to there.
I have a quick question more kind of on the depth.
Yeah, quick questions. I never have short answers. So.
It's more so specific to kind of what I'm going through now. I'm currently writing a journal article about my research. It's very data analytical heavy. So my method and materials section is very long, has a lot of equations, little equations, because it's very much step by step. I have to get from A to B to C, like there's all these things. When I come to my discussion section, there's very, very few articles that I can actually relate my research to, because, so I'll just say the research that I'm conducting, most papers are done on a watershed-based scale, where my research has been now focused down to a field scale. And there's very few research papers that have done that. So what I've tried to do a little to compensate a little bit from my discussion is talk about how more of this research can be applied, where it can be applied to the broad aspect of that. But do you have any other pointers of what I could add to my discussion?
So I think you're on the right track relative to that whole discussion section is all about putting meaning to your study.
Right.
So discussion and kind of conclusions. So I kind of view discussion as, okay, so you have the numbers, you said very analytical, very data focused, you got the outputs.
Yep.
Broadly defined in tables or whatever the outputs are. So the discussion is, okay, so what does that mean? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it high? Is it low? Is it consistent? Is it inconsistent? Those kinds of things. So those of us that don't get it, it's like, oh yeah, an alpha of 97. Yeah, an alpha only goes to 10. So that's kind of a bad thing, whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the discussion piece. So it's really helping us know what those previous pieces are actually telling us. Then when you go into the conclusions, now you're starting to also look back of, okay, so from what you did, that's where you start to tie the bow back to your objectives, hypotheses, et cetera. So yeah, we supported the null hypothesis, we rejected this, we described this, or whatever you said you were going to do. And then you can start to look at, okay, so what is so that's all. maybe not literally, but it's kind of like maybe objective by objective of kind of your conclusions for those. But then you get into, and then there's another term that can be used for this, but then kind of towards the end of that is now you start to collapse those together. So sometimes you may have like the goal of this paper is this, our specific objectives for this, this, and this. Okay, so then you kind of reverse that in your conclusions of, we found this, this, and this relative to our 3 objectives. Now let's consolidate those, or kind of let's go from being on the dance floor to the balcony. Let's step back and let's look at, okay, so as we put all 3 of those discussions or conclusions together, what does that mean for the whole purpose of your study? And then you can maybe kind of start to relate, and you're talking about your discussion of the data, and is it consistent with other research? Is it not? If there's not a lot of stuff out there, then you don't have a lot that you can reference it to.
Okay.
But you could also kind of maybe talk a little bit about what this could mean
Right, okay,
relative to, on this field, what does that mean though, relative to the bigger watershed?
right, okay,
You probably talked about why you're funneling down to the field version,
right,
or the field level, not the watershed level. Okay, so you found this at this level. Okay, so what does that mean then if you think about it in the bigger watershed context? Even though there may not be more studies at other field level trials, but you found this at this, what is that?
right,
A lot of times it seems like, so you're disaggregating. It almost seems like studies are more aggregating, like, oh, we've got all this research at like field level. Now let's step back and let's do something much bigger, more comprehensive at a watershed type level. Though you've got something here and up there and over there that we know all these points, but what is our bigger study? But you're like digging into it, or reverse engineering.
yep, very much so.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't mean, if you don't have 97 papers you can reference, there's like, oh, this is like all 87 of these and not like these 10. Yeah, but that's the nature of the literature that's out there.
Okay. I really appreciate it, that helps.
So, yeah, so I have a question, like, do you have any tips, like when you write the literature of review? But one thing I always face a challenge when I read some paper and when I try to write in my own wordings, I always come up with the same words kind of. So how to rephrase these sentences? So do you have any approach or like?
So what that's kind of telling me maybe is that in the literature review, you're not to the, where's it at in here? Nope, maybe. I thought I had the word, it's in here. Here. You're not quite to the synthesizing piece because you're still thinking about writing about this paper. But what you need to be writing about is this group of papers. The literature review is you're talking about different way. The body of literature is the forest. The trees are the papers. You're still describing this oak standing over here. You're not describing this area of the forest of like, there's some oaks and there's some pines and there's some hackberries and whatever. The general gist is approximately 80% of the forest is oaks and the other 20% is made up of these nasty cedars. You're still saying tree 1 is an oak, tree 2 is an oak, tree 3 is a cedar, tree 4 is an oak. You're not stepping back and saying, what are all the, almost literally like laying the papers out saying, okay, I've got these 4 papers that are about whatever this topic is. What does this one say? What does that one say? What is this? And it's hard to do on a screen. That's why I'm old school back when like we printed stuff out and like had them in binders with Post-it notes and tabs and 3 colors of highlighters and that sort of stuff. But it's like almost literally like, okay, so what is this pile of my papers telling me here? And how I go about, I'm not saying this is right, but when I'm doing like a lit review, I'll do my outline. I'll go through and what are my topics? What are the things I want to discuss and what do I want to describe? What are the things that go under this subsection and put the bullets of these, this assay is working, this one's not, these crops are working, these crops are not. And then I kind of have those. And then basically as I kind of go back through my papers, then I put the citations in those sections like, oh yeah, Jones and Smith and Burgundy and Red, whatever, they were all in this section. So then I pull all those papers together and then I can kind of write about that general concept of describing them as a group of papers, not as a 3 individuals, but as one group of 3 rather than 3 individuals.
So you are right. I always read one paper and try to write in my words, so it's always come in the same.
Yeah, and that's good knowing that that paper said that,
Mhm.
but then you have to put that paper with the one next to it, and then put those 2 with the one next to that. And then that's where you start to kind of think about the trends. What is the trend or the generalities that's happening within this population of papers that I have here relative to this idea?
Mhm. Yeah,
So
yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
thinking of all kinds of, I'm a visual, I use these kind of example sort of things like, it's all about the forest, not the trees. It's all about the group of the paper, laying them out, the visual sort of thing of pulling yourself up out of them off the dance floor and looking at it from the balcony, those kinds of things. So let's see, what have I left you with? Trees and forests, dance floors and balconies,
Pigs.
3 little pigs,
Chicken, ducks.
chickens, ducks, and pineapples.
Oranges, fruits.
Yeah, oranges and apples. You got all these keywords in your notes and you're like, I have no idea what this presentation was all about. Fruits and animals, yeah. All right, other questions? I know I'm keeping you over time, but I appreciate the questions. That's where the value comes.
I have a kind of like a more basic question. It's if you want to start to write a paper, so you already have all your information. So where kind of to start to make kind of more easy to make those transactions between each sections? Like, I mean, to the introductions, your methodology, because you have your recipe, your results, and then you go back, I don't know, like kind of like where kind of like to start on that to write.
So you sit down, you click on Word, new doc, and then
Exactly.
now what? Well, it looks like it's time for another cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Back to a blank screen and darn it, the words didn't just appear. Start with your title, get that, your general idea, your thesis there. I have always worked best from outlines.
Yeah.
Of just, so those of you that have been in FFA, when I was in high school, I did speech contest. It killed me as a senior because we had to turn in a manuscript. I never wrote a manuscript for a speech in my life. I had a note card with like 7 little key topics and I just talked through the outline. My speech was never the same 2 times in a row. Generally it was, but like not verbatim. So it killed me when I had to have a manuscript. And then I got off the manuscript, like, which paragraph am I? Oh, then I got to like doing that whole 1 to 3 to 2 to 9 to then I left out 5 through 8. That completely screwed me. So I've always been that start from a framework and then build out from there. So I go in, I do my section heads. What is the journal wanting from the content areas? What needs to be in there? And then kind of that, depending on where you are mentally, maybe kind of your intro and lit review. Hopefully you've at least kind of thought through that and done some of that before you did your research. I know people that had came in on a grant and so they just did the project and then they went back and wrote their intro and stuff after they did their, what good was it? Anyway, so maybe kind of hit some of those key topics that need to go in that intro and that review. If you're having that writer's block, jump into the methods section because that's pretty objective. You know what you did. It doesn't really change how you maybe describe it could, but at least start, dropping in your topics of flow in your objective section. Then maybe I know some people, and I haven't really done this, but like they jump into results and they start building out their data tables first. These are the results that I want to talk about, that I need to emphasize, that I need to include. So I'm building in either my data tables or my figures or your visuals that go with your results section. So start dropping those in there. Then you can go back and kind of write around those of, introducing the sections of your results or, I'm a huge proponent, which I guess I should be on an editorial board because of this. I'm a huge proponent of putting the results and discussion together. Like, here's what we found and here's what it means. It's like, then you can just like talk about it all together as you're going through, not, well, here's what I found, what I found, what I found, what I found. Here's what it means. And I got to flip back up to that. And then I got to Or then you, in my opinion, then you get duplication, because then they try to bring enough data down into the discussion that you remember what you talked about or you presented in the result. So, okay, there's another one of like 19 soapboxes that I've gotten on this afternoon. My apologies. And so in that result, you know, maybe get those visuals in there that are going to be the data that then you can come back and talk about and work on the writing piece. The one that my argument, the one that's least fleshed out usually, that's probably the most important though, are these down here. Those of you that are PhDs, when you did your master's, your thesis, my guess would be that that's the sections that came back the most that said, no, more, tell me more, explain, why, what for, really, prove it, you know, those kinds of things. Because you're all like, yep, still living the trauma from that. So that's going to be the hard part, but don't shy away from that. Start with those, not start with those, but just jump into those, take it on knowing that, yep, I'm going to have to do more work on these. Because if you get something down here, you maybe come back and work on explaining some of this or tightening up how you describe this or whatnot, then this becomes cold. And then you can go back and read it fresh from a new perspective, like, oh, wow. What do I mean by that? Or, man, I didn't really describe that. My graduate students would probably tell you that, not as much lately, but historically, the phrase I use the most is why and so what? Because in some of these pieces, like they make some kind of a declarative statement, which is good. I mean, it's a really good conclusion. Like, all right, so what? What's that mean? How does that contribute to the literature? How does that, what? The other thing I look at in paper reviews is as you're making like conclusions and recommendations and stuff, like, well, that's a really good recommendation, but there's nothing in your paper that supports that recommendation. You say that we should like plow stubble 6 feet deep. That's awesome. Your project had nothing to do with tillage and there was no plow ever involved in your study. So why do you suggest we should plow at 6 feet deep? I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but those are the things that when I review papers for journals, I look at it as like, okay, so these are good, but how are you basing these off of the data and how you're describing the data to be able to build into that as a recommendation? That's when I didn't put up your recommendations is also kind of in that conclusions and recommendations. Awesome recommendations, but I'm not going to do it based on your study because your study doesn't support that recommendation. So, see, long answer to a really short question, really long answer to a very short question. But just like you don't read papers necessarily from title to references, you don't necessarily have to build your paper from title to references. At some point, you should read your paper from title to references before you submit it. Okay? Preferably after you've let it set for a few days. Because your brain knows what it should say. Your brain doesn't always process what it actually says when you go back and read it.
Yeah.
I remember the day FedEx dropped off the box of my bound dissertations on my front porch. Awesome, I got them. I opened it up. My first thought was, I don't remember there being a checkbox that said double-sided. I set it up for single-sided. So I had an 1.5 inch margin here and an inch margin there. Well, then they double-sided it and all the back pages dove into the fold. So that was my first, that was, I picked up, I thumbed through it, I stopped like, huh, there's a typo. Yes, this whole transition and flow thing, let it get cold. Leave it for a while, then come back. Because that's what's happening with your major professor on either your articles or your chapters and things that your thesis, it gets cold for them. It's back on your plate to make revisions and they do a whole bunch of other stuff. So then when they get it, they're kind of rereading it sort of for the first time. I mean, like 1.5 times, not like this. It's not completely new to them, but it's sat for a while. And so it's like, well, wait a minute. And it's okay to politely say, wait a minute. You're saying to change this from A to B. Previous version, you said change it from B to A. Let's talk about this. Yeah. Hey, y'all laughed, this happened, hadn't it? But it's okay to bring it up. And they're like, oh yeah, we did talk about that. Yeah, my bad. Leave it the way it was. Or but at least bring it up and then you can get some clarity to that. Politely, hey.
Politely.
Yeah, politely. But it's because it got cold and they're kind of reviewing it with new eyes again. And so that's how those sorts of things come up. Same thing when you read it, like, you know what it should say, but you're not reading it as to what it really says.
I say that all the time.
Yep, exactly.
I know what I meant. May or may not be what it says.
Guys, just like cliffhangers are bad in papers, don't presume that your readers are going to be mind readers. They're paper readers. They're reading the paper, not your mind. So, all right. I know I've kept you way over time. I apologize. I love the questions. I appreciate the
Sorry.
No.
We apologize for keeping you.
I'm good until 6:30, literally. So I mean, I could keep answering questions and conversing, but I don't want you feeling like I got dinner at 5:30 and still talking. Get out of here. But I think maybe somewhere in this is maybe my contact. Yeah. Feel free to shoot me an email, or I'm on 3rd floor Hamburger. You need to get out of Throckmorton for a while, like, cause you got that paper back that said change it back to A and you just need to go for a walk. 3rd floor Hamburger, feel free to come over. Be happy to visit. Got candy if you just need to sit and chill. Not a problem. I get that. My students probably end up in Throckmorton. No, I appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation to come over. Thank you. We love helping students try to work through this process, because even you dissertation, doctoral students, it's still a learning process. And sometimes we as faculty, if we've been doing it for 5, 10, 25 years, like, oh yeah, this is still your first time at getting a master's. You're my 97th master's student, but it's still your first time of getting a master's. So we gotta maybe have to stop and rethink. So happy to help you out with that.